Hello and welcome back, and if you're new to my channel, my name is Jennifer and I make stuff. And in this video, it's no difference, it's all about being creative yet again. That's all my channel is about. And why we're actually here in my bedroom at this particular wall is the fact that all this time that I've been living in this apartment, I've always been thinking about what am I gonna do about this wall, because it is in a place in my bedroom there's like pretty covered up and I can't really have any kind of shelves there because when I open the door it's going to hit the wall and all that. So I have been a little bit undecided what I'm actually gonna do about this wall, if I'm going to add some kind of wallpaper to it or if I'm gonna maybe have some kind of light sources. I just recently got well from being sick with the flu. And like I've always done for the last 10 years, the one thing that I always turn myself to watch during the times when I'm awake and not sleeping is the extended cuts of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It includes extra materials that are like, I don't know how many hours on each movie there are to watch on how they made the Lord of the Rings movies. This time I actually got an idea. I don't know if it was the fever that was talking or if it's actually a clever idea. But I just open up the inside of this box here. The first thing you see is the map of Middle Earth. And I've been thinking about for a long time to actually make something on the wall in my bedroom. When I saw this, I was like, right, why don't I make the Middle Earth map on the blank spot on my wall in my bedroom? That's where I am today. I took some measurements of this wall and some pictures, and then I played around a bit in Photoshop to see what I could actually do with a Middle Earth map, because the measurements of the actual map wasn't actually going to cover up the entire wall. So I decided to actually include some details that are part of the actual Lord of the Rings story, like the Fellowship, and then we have Barad-Dur there, and I felt like those details would be perfect to fill those empty areas. So the plan is to sketch out all the outlines using the grid system as a guide. Then I'm going to use acrylics to paint this painting onto my wall. Yeah, that's the plan that I have. And finally I can have something on this wall instead of a blank space and have something that is related to me and what I love, and combining it with doing something creative and do something that I've been looking forward to during those 2 weeks that I was home sick with the flu. I think it's time to start sketching the design onto this wall. Since the process of adding all of these grid lines is actually very time consuming, plus you can't really see the lines and the details that I'm adding using the ruler and the pencil, I'm just going to make a quick time lapse here, but you're seeing that I'm adding some tiny dots where I'm going to add the actual lines, so I know that I have the right distance between each square. If you think about the process of drawing the actual map of Middle Earth and some other details, you can get away with some details not being perfect. But when you're going to work on human figures, the picture that I found was in a low resolution. Further away it looks good, but close up it's a blurry, blobby mess. After I printed these papers out, I actually managed to find a higher resolution picture so I could see these details close up. Since you're working on something that are much bigger, smaller details are going to be much bigger also. So if you want it to be more accurate, it would be great if you had a higher resolution picture of the reference that you're working from. But these outlines are just guides to know where I'm going to place all of those details, and then I can just look at the reference picture with a higher resolution and just add the details that I couldn't see in the low resolution picture. I just want to make sure that the proportions and all of that and the size and the placement and all that looks correct before I can move on to the next step with adding more details and then start painting. As you may have noticed by this point in the painting process, all of these tiny details that I'm adding are just freehand. They are not sketched out from the beginning. The only lines that I have sketched out are all the thicker outlines of the map on all the different areas. Because all of the tinier details I decided to just look at each square from the reference picture and just try to make it as accurate as possible to the reference that I'm working from, and just work freehand, adding all of the details, all the lines and all the mountains and stuff in the areas that seems to look the most accurate and the most correct to my eyes. And also, in the beginning you saw that I did a mixture of the acrylic paints, because it might look like the paint is completely black when you look at it from further away, but it is actually a grayish toned sepia dark brown shade. So in the areas where the paint is a little bit thinner, you're going to notice that it has this kind of grayish brown tint to it. You may notice here that I have actually just quickly sketched out, also freehand, but using a pencil, just adding some simple details of where all the mountains and some of the smaller trails and some trees are going to be, just to save more time when I'm going to fill in these details using the acrylic brush. And if I feel like some details are a little bit off, then I can just use the paintbrush and adjust some of the details using the paintbrush to what looks better to my eyes as the finished result. For the leathering process, I first thought that I was going to use this flat, wide brush because I thought that it was the closest that I had to a calligraphy brush, and I thought that that's the brush that I need for these kind of leathering. Because the leathering here seems to be a little bit of a mixture of the Hobbiton and the Aneron font, so I just played around with what I could see on the map. But later on, you're going to notice that I decided to switch to a smaller flat brush because I have never done this kind of leathering before, so I wasn't really that sure what kind of brush I was going to use for this process. But in the end, I realized that the simplest way to get closer to what I could see in the reference that I was working from was just a tiny thin brush, and then I could just build up the details to the style and the thickness that I was going for. So now it's finally time to start working on the acrylic process. And when you're working with acrylics, you have to go from darker shades and then add lighter and lighter shades. But also here you're going to see that I'm going to first go over with a thin down layer first of a sepia brown shade, and you're going to see here that I'm first working on this thin down coat on, for example, the Black Tower and some of the mountains, just so I get all those shadow details down, and it's going to be much easier for me when I'm going to build up the contrast with more and more layers and details. And I felt very confident when I was doing this layer, but when I was actually starting to work on the background that is supposed to be the actual sea, if the acrylic was too thin down with water, it had a bit of a difficulty to actually stay in place or get an even application. So it was looking very spotty and uneven. So I felt like I was going to trust the process, and one of the first things that I actually did was adding a darker shadow around those details that I had added, for example, around those lakes and the edge of the map. So I felt like it was better if I, instead of having those wiggly lines, I'm going to add a deeper shadow effect instead. Just that detail made such a huge difference to the overall look of the design. And then I could just start working on building up with more and more layers. So you're going to see that I'm starting with some medium tone golden brown shades and build up to more of those kind of sand beige shades, and as bright as possible so it looks close to that look of old stained paper. And then I did the exact same layering process but working on the mountains, and I focused on also making sure that the mountains that is in the background has more of a lighter shade to them, but the mountains that are more in the foreground has more of a deeper contrast to them. And you're also going to notice that when I'm adding these details on top of the mountains, some of the texts that are actually on the map is going to be hidden behind these mountains. And at first I thought that I was going to add those names later, but I feel that it looks much better if I just have the map in the background behind the mountains, so it has more of this layering effect instead of having this map fading into the mountains. So this is what it looks like when a fever dream becomes reality. It has been, well, around half a year since I started with this project. But obviously I didn't spend 6 months working on this project. I have been working on other projects in between, so that's why I had to take a break from this project. So this project was a little bit like 2 videos in one. And with that I mean the process when I was actually working on the actual map. When I was finished adding all those details, I could have stopped just right there and I would have a perfect vinyl looking mural that was only the outlines and all of the text. I obviously did another part like the Fellowship and Barad-Dur and the Misty Mountains and all that, because the wall that I worked on wasn't big enough for me to fit the actual map. When I was going over this part, I felt that I was maybe going over with too much of this kind of reddish brown mixture that I had made. So when I worked on that part, it started to look very dark and I was a little bit worried that maybe I had made a huge mistake now. I tried to remove those details by spraying some water, rubbing it with either a sponge so it would try to remove at least the worst part of it, and then I tried to go over with a thin down mixture of yellow ochre. And thankfully I managed to decrease the effect of that kind of reddish tint and made it more to a golden brown, because I wanted to give the effect that this is a map that is very old, that it has been through many generations after the story of the Lord of the Rings. So someone has inherited the map and it has gotten damaged, and these different variations of tones are supposed to look like an old map, but also has accidentally gotten some stains, like someone have accidentally spilled some tea on it or whatever you could think of. But also I wanted it to look like someone has tried to add some of the ink back to the map again. And that's why I decided to fill in the names of those areas that is actually supposed to be part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, so you can see the entire journey from the Shire and all the way up to Rivendell and Moria, and then when the Fellowship is split apart, the different trails that each character is going through their own journey until they are all reunited again. And I also decided to add a dark outline all the way around the edge of the map where the sea is supposed to be, because it looked very uneven, a little bit unfinished without a stark black outline on the edge of the map. It's a little bit hard for me to just pick one part that was a favorite part, but if you think about the part that I enjoyed the most to create, it was actually all of the silhouettes of the entire Fellowship here. Because I felt like I had a little bit more freedom when it comes to this part, because it was pretty much only black silhouettes. I just felt at some point that I didn't really need to look at the reference picture, I just wanted to play around with the details myself. So it would be pretty much my own take of this part of the mural. But yeah, that's the finished result of this entire mural, and I'm super happy with the finished result. It's so much more than the vision that I had at first. Had a little bit more liberty when it comes to the color applications and all that. And I really love that it has more of those cool tones up here that blends into those warm tones up on the actual map. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.